Please, don't mind me. I'll follow you, Chichikov said. Oh, no, you're the guest, Manilov said, inviting him with a wave of the hand to go in first. But please, do go ahead. Don't worry about me. Never. No, how could I allow myself such a thing with a delightful and distinguished guest like you? But why am I distinguished? Please, let me go in after you. No, please, go ahead. But for what reason? A very good reason, Manilov said with a pleasant smile. Finally, they went through the door at the same time, sideways and crowding each other somewhat. Allow me to present my wife. Darling, this is Pavel Ivanovich Chichikov. Chichikov looked at the lady whom he had failed to notice before, so absorbed had he been in his politeness toward Manilov. She wasn't bad-looking and was becomingly dressed. Her pale silk negligée fitted her well. Her delicate hand threw something down on the table and clutched at a cambric handkerchief with embroidered corners. She rose from the divan, and Chichikov kissed her hand with a certain pleasure. She told him with an elegant lisp that they were delighted with his visit, and that a day never went by without her husband's mentioning him. Yes, Manilov said. My wife has kept asking me, how is it your friend hasn't come to see us? And then I'd tell her, wait, my pet, he'll come. Yes, believe me, your visit is a real joy to us, like a day in May, a birthday of the heart. Hearing that things had reached the point of birthdays of the heart, Chichikov actually became a bit embarrassed and remarked that he did not come from a famous family, nor did he even hold an exalted rank. You have everything, Manilov assured him with the same pleasant smile. You have everything and even more. How do you like our town? Mrs. Manilov wanted to know. Have you been having a good time there? A very fine, a splendid town, Chichikov said. I've had a wonderful time and the people are most cordial. And how did you find our governor? She said. Don't you think he's a most worthy and at the same time a most amiable man? Manilov suggested. Absolutely so, Chichikov said. A most worthy man. How he devotes himself to his work and what a remarkable grasp he has. I wish we had more like him. It is really extraordinary how he knows how to treat people, whoever they may be, and how much tact he can display. Manilov contributed and was so pleased with what he had said that he half closed his eyes like a tomcat being tickled behind the ears. A very amiable and courteous man, Chichikov went on, and an artist to boot. Who would have guessed he could embroider so nicely? He showed me a purse he had embroidered, and I tell you there are few ladies who could do as well. And the vice-governor? Isn't he a nice man? Manilov said, again slightly lowering his lids. A very, very worthy man, Chichikov answered. And, if I may ask, how did you find our chief of police? Isn't he nice? Oh, yes, very nice indeed, and very intelligent, and well-read, too. I spent a night playing whist at his place. The public prosecutor and the president of the district court were there, and we stayed until the last roosters had finished their crowing. A very, very worthy man. And what about his wife? Isn't she a charming woman? Mrs. Manilov inquired. Oh, she's one of the most admirable women I've ever met, Chichikov declared. After that, they discussed the president of the district court, the postmaster, and almost all the officials of the town, and they all turned out to be most worthy people. Do you spend all your time in the country? Chichikov asked his hosts in his turn. Mostly, Manilov said, although from time to time we drive into town just to meet educated people. One gets out of touch, living in retirement like this. Yes, that's true, Chichikov said. Of course, Manilov went on, things would be different if we had some neighbor with whom we could, for instance, discuss polite usage, the proper way of doing things, or with whom we could follow, say, a science or something that could grasp us here by the heart and make our souls soar. He wanted to further express his thought, but realizing that he had got somewhat mixed up, merely waved his hand and went on. Then, of course, the country life and the isolation would have many charms. But here there's absolutely no one around, so there's nothing left for us to do but dip into the Patriot from time to time. Chichikov agreed and added that nothing could be more pleasant than living in isolation, enjoying the beauties of nature, and dipping into a book from time to time. But Manilov added, If you haven't got anyone to share it with all. If you haven't got anyone to share it all with. Yes, of course, you're absolutely right, Chichikov interrupted him. All the treasures of the world are worth nothing unless you have pleasant people around you, as a sage once said. And you know what? Manilov said, the expression of his face beyond sweetness, like the sort of syrup that a clever, fashionable doctor prescribes in the hope of pleasing his patient. Then you experience a sort of, how shall I put it, spiritual enjoyment. Like, for instance, now, when I have the good fortune to be talking to you and enjoying your delightful conversation. Oh, no. What kind of interesting conversation have I to offer you? I'm just a non-entity, Chichikov protested. Oh, please, let me be perfectly frank with you. I'd gladly renounce half my estate for a few of your qualities. Just the other way around. I would consider it the greatest. There's no way of telling where this mutual admiration would have ended if a servant hadn't announced that dinner was served. I humbly beg you to partake, Manilov said. And you must forgive us if our dinner is not up to the standards you are accustomed to in the capital. We have simple Russian cooking here. Plain cabbage soup. But it is offered from the bottom of our hearts. Once more they had an argument about who should go in first, and finally Chichikov slipped sideways into the dining room. Manilov's two sons were already waiting. They had reached the age when children are allowed to eat at the table with the grown-ups, but are still seated in high chairs. Their tutor stood behind them, bowing with a polite smile. The hostess took her seat behind the soup tureen. The guest was placed between the host and hostess. A servant tied napkins around the children's necks. What lovely children, Chichikov said. And how old are they? The older is going on 8, and the younger one had his 6th birthday just yesterday, their mother said. Themistocleus, Manilov said, addressing his older son, who was trying to extract his chin from the napkin, which the servant had tied around it. Chichikov raised an eyebrow when he heard this Greek-sounding name, to which, for some mysterious reason, Manilov had given an "ius" ending. However, he hastily lowered his eyebrow back to its usual position. Tell me, Themistocleus, which is the finest city in France? At this point, the tutor seemed to concentrate his entire attention on Themistocleus, and it looked as though he wished to jump inside him, down through his eyes. Finally, he relaxed, as Themistocleus said, Paris. And what about us? What's our finest city? Manilov asked again. Petersburg, Themistocleus said. And another one? Moscow, Themistocleus answered. What a sweet, brilliant child, Chichikov commented. Looking quite surprised, he turned to the parents and went on. But I must say the child seems to possess uncanny abilities. Oh, you haven't heard anything yet, Manilov said. He is terribly witty. The younger, Alcides, he's not quite as sharp, but Themistocleus, when he comes across a fly or an insect, his eyes light up and he'll rush after it and bring it to show you. I want him to take up a diplomatic career. Themistocleus, he said, turning to the child, do you wish to become an ambassador? I do, Themistocleus said, munching a piece of bread and letting his head roll from right to left and then from left to right. At that moment, the lackey who stood behind him wiped the ambassador's nose, and it was a good thing, too, because otherwise a drop of extraneous matter would have dripped into his soup. The conversation then centered on the pleasures of a quiet life, interspersed with remarks from the hostess about the theater and actors. The children's tutor observed the speakers attentively, and as soon as he noticed that they were about to smile, he opened his mouth and laughed dutifully. Probably he was a grateful man, and this was his way of repaying his employers for treating him decently. But at one moment his face grew severe, and he rapped sternly on the table, glaring at the boys who sat opposite him. And he was right, too, because Themistocleus had bitten Alcides' ear, and Alcides had already half closed his eyes and opened his mouth and was all set to bawl pitifully. But then, feeling that it might easily cost him the rest of his dinner, he forced his mouth into its previous position, and with tears in his eyes, he proceeded to chew on a mutton bone so that both his cheeks became shiny with fat. Throughout the dinner, the hostess kept turning toward Chichikov and saying, "You're not eating anything. You haven't taken enough." To which he invariably replied, "Thank you very, very much. I have taken enough, and then, such delightful conversation is more enjoyable to me than any food." By and by, they got up from the table. Manilov was terribly pleased with the way things were going. He put his hand on Chichikov's shoulder and was about to steer him into the drawing room when the guest suddenly announced, with a meaningful look, that he first wished to discuss an important matter with him. "In that case, shall we go into my study?" Manilov said, and led him into a small room with a window, looking out on the bluish forest. "This is my little corner," Manilov said. "Nice little room," Chichikov said, looking it over. And indeed, the room was rather pleasant. The walls were painted pale blue, almost gray. And there were 4 straight chairs, 1 armchair, and a table on which lay the book with the bookmark in it, which we mentioned earlier, and a few sheets of paper covered with writing. But the one thing the room was really rich in was tobacco. It was evident in various shapes and forms, in boxes, in a tobacco jar, and even in a heap on the table. And on both windowsills there were little mounds of ash knocked out of pipes and arranged quite effortlessly in rather pretty rows. Obviously, on occasion, this provided the master of the house with a pastime. "Please make yourself comfortable in the armchair," Manilov suggested. "Please allow me to take a straight chair." "Allow me, please, to decline your request," Manilov said, smiling. "This chair is specially intended for my guests, and whether you like it or not, you must sit in it." Chichikov sat down. "May I offer you a pipe?" "No, thank you, I don't smoke," Chichikov said gently, with a suggestion of regret. "How so?" Manilov said, also gently and with a semblance of regret. "I'm afraid I've never got into the habit. And then they say a pipe dries one out." "Allow me to tell you that is a prejudice. I believe pipe smoking is healthier than taking snuff. In my regiment, there was a lieutenant, the nicest, best-educated fellow you could imagine, who never let his pipe out of his mouth, not only at table, but everywhere else, if you'll pardon my saying so. And today he's already past 40, and thank God, he's as healthy as ever." Chichikov agreed that such things did happen, and that in nature there were many phenomena which were inexplicable even to the most powerful intellect. "But allow me first to ask you something," he said in a voice in which there was a strange, or at least an almost strange, intonation. Having said this, for some mysterious reason, he looked around him. Manilov somehow did the same. "How long is it since you last submitted a list of your serfs to the census?" "Quite a while. I don't remember exactly." "Tell me, have many of your peasants died since then?" "That's something I couldn't tell you offhand. I'll have to call my manager." "Hey there, fellow. Ask the estate manager to come to my study. I think he must be around today." The manager appeared. He was about 40, clean-shaven, wore a frock coat, and apparently led a very quiet life because his face had a sort of puffy look, while his yellowish complexion and narrowed eyes indicated that he knew too much about the charms of feather beds and comforters. It was possible to tell right away that he had reached his position in the same way as had so many of his colleagues. First, he was just a houseboy who could read and write. Then he had married some housekeeper, a favorite of his mistress, had himself become a steward to start with, and after that a manager. And once a manager, he acted, of course, like all managers. He was chummy with the better-off villagers while squeezing the life juice out of the poorer ones. And in the mornings, he woke up around 9 and took it easy until the samovar was brought in and he was served his tea. "Tell me, my friend, how many of our peasants have died since the last census?" "How many? A lot of them have died since," the manager said, hiccuping and half shielding his mouth with his hand. "Yes, I must admit that's just what I thought myself," Manilov chimed in. "Just as he says, many have died." And turning toward Chichikov, he repeated again, "Yes, that's it, many." "Can you give me a figure?" Chichikov asked. "Yes, what about a figure?" Manilov echoed. "Why, how can I possibly give a figure since no one knows how many of them have died? No one's counted them." "Exactly," Manilov told Chichikov. "I also assume that the mortality rate was very high, and it's absolutely impossible to tell how many of them have died." "Will you kindly count them?" Chichikov told the manager. "And I would like a full list of their names." Yes, every one of them by name, Manilov said. The manager said, "Yes, sir," and left. "And why do you want these names?" Manilov asked when the manager had gone. This question seemed to take the guest somewhat aback, and his expression betrayed an effort to find words. He even turned red under the strain. And then, indeed, Manilov heard things that were stranger and more unusual than any that had ever reached human ears before. "You asked me why I want to know. Well, here's why. I am interested in buying serfs," Chichikov stammered, failing to complete a statement. "But, allow me to ask, how would you like to buy the serfs? With land, or just piecemeal, without land?" "No, you see, it's not quite serfs I'm after," Chichikov said. "What I need is the dead ones." "I beg your pardon, sir. Excuse me, I'm somewhat hard of hearing, and I fancied you said a very strange word. I intend to acquire dead serfs who, however, were listed as alive in the last census," Chichikov explained. Manilov opened his mouth and his pipe dropped to the floor. He remained with his mouth gaping for several minutes. The two friends who had just been discussing the pleasant aspects of friendship now remained motionless, staring into each other's eyes like the portraits done in profile that in the old days used to be hung facing one another on each side of a mirror. Finally, Manilov bent to pick up his pipe and glanced from below into Chichikov's face to see if there wasn't a smile on his lips and it had all just been a joke. But he found nothing of the sort. On the contrary, Chichikov's expression seemed, if anything, even more serious than usual. Then he wondered whether his guest had not gone mad just like that and examined him anxiously again. But the guest's eyes were completely clear, and there was no wild, tormented fire in them, no flame of the kind that dances in the eyes of a madman. No, everything was seemly and proper. However hard Manilov tried, he could think of nothing better to do than to let the smoke out of his mouth. And he let it out in a very thin stream. "I simply want to know whether you could let me have serfs such as I have described, not live ones in reality, but alive in the legal sense. Whether you would transfer them or sell them or whatever you feel is best." But Manilov was so confused and bewildered that he just kept staring at Chichikov. "It seems you're finding it difficult to give me an answer," Chichikov said. "Who, me? No, it's not that, but I can't comprehend. Forgive me, I, of course, haven't had the benefits of an education comparable to yours, which is apparent in your every movement, nor do I have a great gift for expressing myself. Perhaps here there's, in the explanation you've just given me, perhaps there's something else to it? Perhaps you just expressed yourself that way for the sake of literary style?" "No," Chichikov said, "I mean it literally. I mean precisely the souls that are already dead." Manilov was completely befuddled. He felt he had to do something, to ask a question, but he was damned if he knew what question to ask. He wound up at last by blowing some more smoke, this time, however, not through his mouth, but through his nostrils. "Well then," Chichikov went on, "if there's nothing in our way, we can go ahead with God's blessing and draw up a purchase deed." What do you mean, a purchase deed for dead souls?" "Oh no, we shall describe them as alive, just the way they were reported to the census. My rule is never to deviate from the civil code, even though I have suffered for it in the course of my career. But you must excuse me and accept me as I am. To me, duty is sacred, and I stand in awe of the law." These last words were altogether to Manilov's liking, although he still couldn't understand what this was all about. So instead of answering, he started to suck on his pipe so hard that finally it started to wheeze like a bassoon. It looked as though he was trying to suck out of it an opinion on the whole incredible business, but the pipe just went on wheezing. Perhaps you have some misgivings. Oh, certainly not. I have no reservations whatsoever about you as a person, but may I ask your opinion on this deal, or let's call it a transaction? Would it really conform to the civil code, and would it help the future prospects of our country? At this point, Manilov made an indefinite motion of the head and gave Chichikov a very meaningful look, his every feature, including the tight-pressed lips, exhibiting a profundity of thought, such as had never been equaled by a human face, except perhaps that of a too clever statesman, and even then only in the moment of solving a brain-racking problem. But Chichikov simply said that such a deal or transaction could not possibly be incompatible with the civil code and the future prospects of Russia, adding a minute later that it would even benefit the national treasury, which would collect its rightful taxes. That's the way you see it? Yes, I consider it would be a good thing. If you consider it a good thing, why, that's another story. I have nothing against it, then, Manilov said, completely reassured. Now all we have to do is to agree upon the price. What do you mean, price? Manilov started, and stopped again, taken aback. Do you really imagine I'll take money for souls which, in a sense, have terminated their existence? If such a, so to speak, fantastic idea has occurred to you, please understand that I would transfer them to you without financial consideration, and I would see to it myself that the purchase deed was drawn up. It would be a grave reflection upon the chronicler of these events if he failed to record that when Manilov uttered these words, his guest was overcome with delight. Dignified and calm though he was, he only just managed to prevent himself from starting to jump about like a goat, a thing which, as is well known, that animal does in its most violent fits of joy. He twisted so violently in his armchair that the woolen pillow cover burst open, and Manilov looked at him with a certain perplexity. Prompted by gratitude, Chichikov heaped thanks upon him until Manilov turned crimson, rotated his head protestingly, and finally declared that it was nothing at all, that he wanted to do something to express the magnetic attraction his heart felt, the kinship between their two souls. As to the dead souls, in a sense they were just plain rubbish. Anything but rubbish, Chichikov said, pressing his hand. At this point, he released a profound sigh, evidently caused by an overflow of feeling, and finally he uttered the following words in a voice filled with emotion. If you only knew what a service you are rendering by donating what seems like rubbish to you to a man without lineage or breeding. Yes, there are a few things I haven't experienced in my life. I am like a bark tossed in furious seas. What oppressions, what persecutions have I not known? What misfortunes have I not suffered? And all this because I venerated the truth, because I kept my conscience clean, because I held out my hand to the widow and the helpless, hapless orphan. And with his handkerchief he dabbed away a tear that had rolled out of one of his eyes. Manilov was touched beyond words. The two friends clasped hands for a long time, looking mutely into each other's eyes in which the tears were welling. Manilov simply refused to release the hand he held in his and went on squeezing it with a zeal that made Chichikov wonder how he was going to retrieve it. Finally, having pulled it gradually away, he remarked that it would be a good thing if they drafted the purchase deed and that he himself had now to go back to town, whereupon he got hold of his hat and started to take his leave. What, you're leaving us already? Manilov said, suddenly recovering his senses and appearing alarmed at the prospect. And as his wife entered the study, he announced to her quite pitifully, "My love, our dear friend is leaving us." "You must be tired of us," she said. "Madame, here." "Yes, Here, Chichikov said, pointing to his heart, here I shall always cherish the heavenly memory of the time I've spent with you. And believe me, there is nothing that would make me happier than to live with you. If not in the same house, then at least as a close neighbor. And you know, Manilov chimed in, liking this idea very much, it would really be a good thing if we lived together under the same roof or in the shade of some elm. Then we could philosophize about one thing and another and delve deep into certain ideas. Indeed, it would be living in paradise, Chichikov said with a sigh. But farewell, madam, he continued, kissing her hand. Farewell to you too, my most esteemed friend, and please don't forget the service I've asked of you. Oh, you may rest assured, Manilov answered and added, we are not going to be parted for more than a couple of days. They all went into the dining room. Farewell, you little darlings, Chichikov exclaimed on seeing Alcides and Themistocleus, whose attention was focused on a wooden hussar which was missing a nose and an arm. Goodbye, my dear little boys. Forgive me for not having brought any candy for you, but I must admit I never even suspected you existed. But I'll bring you something the next time I come. Would you like a saber? I would, Themistocleus replied. And what about you? I bet you'd like to have a drum, Chichikov said, bending toward Alcides. Boom, 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 Alcides whispered, lowering his head. All right, I'll bring you a drum, a fine one that goes boom, 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 tra-ta-ta. So goodbye, my sweet, farewell. He kissed the child's head and turned toward the Manilovs with a laugh, which was intended to indicate to the parents how sweet he found the innocence of their child's wishes. Really, my dear friend, you ought to stay, Manilov said when they were already outside the house. Look at those clouds gathering. They're just small clouds, Chichikov said. Anyway, are you sure you know the way to Sobakevich's? I was just going to ask you about that. Just a minute, I'll explain to your coachman. And Manilov explained the way to the man with the same amiability and once even called him Mr. Cellophane. Manilov remained standing on the doorstep for a long time, watching the carriage growing smaller in the distance, and when it had disappeared altogether, he still stood there, smoking his pipe. Finally, he went back into the house, sat down on a chair, and reflected contentedly that he had succeeded in affording his guest a pleasant time. Then his thoughts gradually turned to other things, and in the end got stranded God knows where. He thought of the blessings of friendship, about how nice it would be to live with a friend on the bank of a river. Then he started to build a bridge across the river. Then a huge house with a belvedere so tall that one could see Moscow from it. And also take one's evening tea there in the fresh air and discuss weighty matters. Then he fancied himself and Chichikov arriving in elegant carriages to join pleasant company. They charmed everyone with their delightful manners. Then, the Tsar, learning of their friendship, bestowed highest honors upon them. And further, he fancied God knows what, such rubbish that he himself could make neither head nor tail of it. Suddenly, the thought of Chichikov's strange request interrupted his daydreams. His brain could not digest it. He kept turning it over and over inside his head without being able to explain it, smoking his pipe all the time. He remained sitting there in this fashion until supper time.